The first thing you need to know is that Jacob Thornfield went to bed a poor man. He was a farmer with no crops, a rancher with no cattle, a husband with no wife. All he owned was 160 acres of stubborn Colorado dirt and a loneliness so sharp it could cut you. He went to bed with the taste of ash in his mouth, and he woke up rich. It wasn't a miracle, not really. Miracles are quiet, gentle things. This was loud and messy, and it had started the night before, with the crack of gunshots tearing through the twilight. Jacob had been mending a fence line, his hands raw, his back aching. The sun was bleeding out behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that makes a man forget the hardships for a moment. Then the peace shattered. Pop, 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 pop. 4 shots, fast and angry, echoing from the direction of Devil's Canyon. Jacob froze. His hand went to the rifle he always carried, a reflex as natural as breathing. Gunshots in this part of the territory meant one of two things: trouble, or a whole lot more trouble. Claim jumpers, rustlers, men running from the law, or men who were the law. He knew the smart thing to do. The smart thing was to turn around, walk back to his empty cabin, and bolt the door. The smart thing was to pretend he'd heard nothing but the wind. He'd survived 3 years out here by being smart, by minding his own business. But there was something wrong with the sound. It wasn't the steady rhythm of a hunt. It wasn't the chaotic spray of a gunfight between equals. It was clean, efficient. It sounded like an execution. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Jacob shouldered his rifle and started walking toward the sound. He moved like a ghost through the scrub oak and pine, his boots making no sound on the dry earth. The canyon opened up before him, a raw wound in the land, and at the bottom he saw the reason for the silence. 3 men were down, sprawled in the dirt like discarded dolls. Their horses grazed nervously nearby, indifferent to the fate of their riders. They were dead. Jacob didn't need to get closer to know that, but they weren't alone. Crouched behind a large boulder was a 4th figure, small, clad in buckskin, with long black hair that shone in the last rays of sunlight. Jacob raised his rifle, squinting down the sight. He saw the figure press a hand to their shoulder, saw the dark stain of blood seeping through their fingers. It was a woman. No, a girl, really. She couldn't have been more than 18. A young native woman, alone and wounded, surrounded by the bodies of her attackers. Jacob had 2 choices: walk away and let the coyotes handle the cleanup, or walk down into that canyon and step into a world of trouble he couldn't even begin to imagine. He lowered his rifle. He knew what his late wife, Sarah, would have wanted him to do, and that was the only law Jacob Thornfield still followed. He started down the rocky path, and with every step, he could feel his quiet, lonely life coming to an end. He just didn't realize that in its place, something else was about to be born. Something that would change everything. He didn't know he was walking toward his destiny, toward a mystery that would unravel over weeks. A mystery that would start with a gift and end with a revelation that would shake the entire territory to its core. The girl looked up as he approached, her dark eyes wide. Not with fear. He'd seen fear before. This was something else. Weariness. Pain. But underneath it all, there was a core of steel. She was like a wounded hawk, still ready to fight, still ready to claw his eyes out if he made a wrong move. Her hand never strayed far from the pistol tucked into her belt. "Easy there," Jacob said, his voice soft. He set his own rifle down, a clear sign of peace, and held up his empty hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." She watched him, her gaze flicking from his face to his rifle and back again. She was assessing him, weighing him, deciding if he was a threat or a fool. "They were hunting me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Her English was perfect, almost unnervingly so. It was the English of boarding schools and East Coast cities, not the broken tongue of the frontier. It was the first clue that this girl was not what she seemed. Jacob looked at the bodies. The men were drifters by the look of them, but their gear was top-notch. Colt revolvers, Winchester rifles. Their saddles were worth more than Jacob's entire cabin. This wasn't some random attack. This was professional. Take you back where? He asked. To a place I will not go, she replied, and the finality in her voice was absolute. She would die in this canyon before she went back. Jacob knelt, his military training kicking in. He surveyed the scene, the positioning of the bodies, the tight grouping of the bullet holes. It told a story. She hadn't just survived an ambush. She had turned it. 3 armed men, professionals, had come to take one wounded girl, and the girl had won. She had outshot them, outfought them, outlived them. This wasn't just a girl. She was a warrior. You need a doctor, he said, looking at the blood still seeping from her shoulder. That wound's deep. I have herbs, she said, her voice tight with pain. Herbs won't stop a bullet from festering. You need it cleaned, stitched. My cabin is close. You can rest there, safely. She studied his face, searching for the lie, the hidden angle. A lone white man offering help to a lone native woman? That story usually ended one way, and it wasn't with a safe place to rest. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the lifetime of mistrust she had learned to carry like a shield. I want nothing from you, Jacob said, and he meant it. It was the truest thing he'd said in 3 years. Just one person helping another. That's all. Something in his words, or maybe just the profound weariness in his own eyes, must have reached her. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. Getting her out of the canyon was a nightmare. She was weak from blood loss, every step in agony. He practically had to carry her the last half-mile. By the time they reached the flickering lamplight of his cabin, she was barely conscious. His home was a simple, one-room affair, built by his own hands. It was clean, orderly, and deeply, achingly empty. It was the home of a man who had forgotten what it was like to share his space with another living soul. He laid her gently in a chair by the fire and went to work. The war had taught him more about bullet wounds than any man should ever know. His hands were steady as he heated water, cut away the buckskin, and cleaned the injury. The bullet went clean through, he said, his voice low and professional. Missed the bone. You're lucky. She just watched him, her eyes never leaving his face. When he had bandaged the wound and helped her sip some hot broth, she finally spoke. My name is Ayanna. Jacob Thornfield. You were a soldier, she said. It wasn't a question. 4 years. Colorado Volunteers. And now you're a farmer. Trying to be. She looked around the quiet cabin, her gaze lingering on the single bed, the one chair at the table, the portrait of a smiling woman on the mantelpiece. You lost her, she said, her voice soft. Jacob stopped what he was doing. The directness of it was like a slap. Most people tiptoed around his grief, afraid to speak its name. My wife, Sarah. Lung fever, 3 years ago. I am sorry. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Outside, the world was dark and dangerous. But inside this little cabin, for the first time in a long time, there was a strange kind of peace. Then Ayanna broke the silence, and the peace shattered into a million pieces. The men who hunted me, she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. They work for a man named Crawford. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Thomas Crawford. The name was a shadow that fell over the entire territory. A cattle baron, a mining magnate, a man who bought politicians and sheriffs like he bought livestock. A man who got whatever and whoever he wanted. What does a man like that want with you? Jacob asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Ayanna's next words confirmed his fears and plunged him into a darkness far deeper than Devil's Canyon. He believes he owns me. Jacob stared at her, the crackling firelight playing across her exhausted features. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He believes he owns me. It was the language of slavery, of men who saw other human beings as property. My stepfather sold me to him when I was 16, Ayanna continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was telling a story she had told herself 1,000 times, building a wall of stone around the pain. He called it a marriage contract. I called it a cage. I escaped 2 years ago. I've been running ever since. The cold fury that rose in Jacob's chest was an old, familiar friend. It was the same rage he'd felt at Shiloh, at Antietam, seeing the casual cruelty men inflicted on one another. The world was supposed to have changed after that war, but out here, on the fringes of civilization, the old evils just wore new faces. "Where will you go now?" he asked. "North, to Canada. I have family there." "That's 1,000 miles of hard country," Jacob said, shaking his head, "especially with winter coming on and a bullet in your shoulder." "It's more dangerous to stay here," she countered. "Crawford's reach is long. His men are everywhere." She was right. Jacob looked around his small isolated cabin. It had been his fortress of solitude, the place he'd hidden from the world. But now it felt like a trap. By bringing her here, he had painted a target on his own back. Crawford was not a man who forgave or forgot. If his men found her here, they would burn this cabin to the ground with both of them inside. He should tell her to leave. He should give her some food, a blanket, and point her north. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then he looked at her, a girl who had fought off 3 hired guns, a girl who had survived 2 years alone in the wilderness, a girl who was refusing to be owned, and he thought of Sarah, who had believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. "You can stay," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Stay until your shoulder is healed. A few weeks. It's isolated here. They won't think to look this far out." Ayana's eyes searched his, a flicker of disbelief in their depths. "Why? Why would you take such a risk for a stranger?" "Because no person should be bought and sold," Jacob said simply. "Because my wife would haunt me if I turned you away." He met her gaze, holding it. "And because I want nothing in return. Understand? Nothing." A tension he hadn't even noticed in her seemed to dissolve. It was as if a set of iron bands around her chest had finally loosened, allowing her to take her first real breath in years. "I accept," she said quietly, "and I thank you." He gave her his bed, taking a roll of blankets for himself by the fire. He lay awake for hours, listening to her quiet breathing, the rifle resting by his side. He had invited the wolf to his door. He had challenged one of the most powerful men in the territory. He had traded his quiet loneliness for a very loud, very dangerous kind of trouble. He finally drifted into a restless sleep, dreaming of gunshots and shadows. And when he woke up just before dawn, the world had changed completely. He stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, a habit born of years of solitude. He liked to watch the sun rise over his land, to see the light chase the shadows from the valleys. It was a small comfort, a predictable start to another lonely day. But this day was different. He blinked. He rubbed his eyes, thinking the sleep was still clouding his vision. He looked again. They were still there. In his north pasture, where there had been nothing but dry grass and dirt the night before, stood a herd of cattle. Not 1 or 2 strays. 20 of them. Prime beef, black Angus, a few Herefords mixed in. They grazed peacefully, their breath misting in the cold morning air, as if they had been there forever. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. He grabbed the fence post for support, his mind reeling. Where had they come from? Who brought them here? In the middle of the night? Without making a sound? He vaulted the fence and walked slowly toward the herd. The animals were calm, well-fed. They were quality stock, worth a small fortune. More money than he had seen in his entire life. He looked closer, his eyes scanning their hides for a brand. Every single one of them was branded, a strange, unfamiliar symbol. A winding river with a star above it. It wasn't a brand he recognized from any of the local ranches. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lost herd. This was deliberate. Someone had driven 20 head of prime cattle onto his land in the dead of night and vanished without a trace. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Ayana stood there, wrapped in one of his blankets, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked from his stunned expression to the cattle in the field. She didn't seem surprised, not in the slightest. "They weren't there last night," Jacob said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No," she agreed. "They were not." He turned to face her, his mind racing through 100 terrifying possibilities. Was this a trap? Was Crawford trying to frame him for rustling? Was this some kind of warning? "Do you know anything about this?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Ayana was silent for a long moment. She watched the cattle, a faint, unreadable smile playing on her lips. It was a look of ancient knowledge, of secrets he couldn't possibly comprehend. "My people have stories," she said softly, her gaze still on the herd. "They say that when you perform an act of great kindness, without expecting reward, the spirits take notice. They say the universe seeks to restore balance. A good deed is a debt, and the world always pays its debts." Jacob stared at her. "You think spirits brought these cattle?" "I think," she said, finally turning her dark eyes to meet his, "that you gave shelter to the hopeless, and the world has given you a future in return." He didn't know what to believe. Spirits? Magic? It was the talk of a world he didn't understand. He was a man of dirt and sweat and iron. Cattle didn't just appear out of thin air. But then again, he was standing in a field full of cattle that had done exactly that. The mystery of the herd consumed him. For the next week, while Ayana rested and recovered in the cabin, Jacob rode a wide circle around his property, searching for answers. He visited his few and far between neighbors, taciturn men who kept to themselves. Had they seen anything? Heard anything? A large herd moving at night would have made noise, left tracks. No one had seen a thing. It was as if the cattle had dropped from the sky. He rode into the small, dusty town that passed for civilization, his rifle across his saddle. The town was practically owned by Crawford, his brand on everything from the saloon to the land office. Jacob felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him as he tied up his horse. He was a stranger here, an outsider. He felt the weight of Crawford's influence in the suspicious glances, the sudden silences when he walked into the general store. He went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison was a heavy-set man with a weary face, a man who had long ago learned the art of looking the other way. Jacob described the cattle, sketched the strange brand on a piece of paper. "Ever see this brand before, Sheriff?" Morrison studied it for a long time, his expression giving nothing away. "Can't say I have. Not registered in this territory, or any of the neighboring ones, far as I know. 20 prime animals just appeared on my land. Someone has to be missing them." "Maybe," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. "Or maybe someone's trying to cause trouble for you, Thornfield. You make any enemies lately?" The question was a warning. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." "I keep to myself," Jacob said. "Good policy," the sheriff grunted. "My advice? Keep the cattle. Don't ask too many questions. Sometimes a gift is just a gift. And sometime," he added, his eyes narrowing slightly, "it's a warning. You just have to figure out which." Jacob rode home with a gut full of unease. The sheriff's words had only deepened the mystery. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, the rules written in a language he couldn't read. Back at the cabin, life settled into a strange new rhythm. Ayana was a quiet presence, but the emptiness of the cabin was gone. She moved with a silent grace, and as her shoulder healed, she began to help with the chores. She showed him which wild roots were edible, how to make a tea from yarrow to soothe his aching back. She was a creature of the wilderness, and she moved through it with a knowledge that Jacob, for all his years on the land, had never possessed. He in turn shared his world with her. He taught her how to sight his rifle, how to break down and clean it until it gleamed. He was surprised by her aptitude. She held the heavy weapon with a steady, practiced ease. Her aim was true, her focus absolute. It was clear the gunfight in the canyon was not her first. In the long, cold evenings, they sat by the fire and they talked. She spoke of her childhood, a strange mix of tribal traditions and mission school education. She was a woman caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He found himself talking about Sarah, about the war, about dreams he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. He was telling her his story, and in the telling, he felt pieces of his frozen heart begin to thaw. He was falling for her. He knew it was madness. She was 15 years his junior, from a different world, a different people, and she was a fugitive with a death sentence hanging over her head. A relationship between them was not just impossible, it was dangerous. It would put them both at risk. But every time he looked at her, every time she smiled that small, secret smile, he felt the loneliness of the past 3 years recede just a little bit more. One afternoon, they were checking the fence line near the south pasture when they saw him. A single rider, sitting on his horse on a distant ridge, watching the cabin. He was too far away to make out his features, but he sat there, still as a statue, for a full 10 minutes. Jacob's blood ran cold. "Get inside," he whispered, pushing Ayana behind him. They watched from the cabin window as the rider finally turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. He hadn't approached. He hadn't made a threat. He had just watched. It was a message. "We know you're there. We know what you have." That night, the easy peace between them was gone, replaced by a thrumming tension. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was real and it was close. "I have to leave," Ayana said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've brought this danger to your door, Jacob. I can't stay." "Where will you go?" he asked, his heart sinking. "It's almost winter. The passes will be snowed in. I'll take my chances." He knew she was right. Every day she stayed, the danger grew. But the thought of her leaving, of this cabin returning to its cold, silent emptiness, was unbearable. He had finally found something to live for again, and now he was going to lose it. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his knuckles white. He kept thinking about the cattle, about the strange brand. It had been nagging at him for weeks, a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He pulled out the scrap of paper where he'd sketched it, a winding river and a star. He'd seen something like it before. In town, on a sign, Crawford's brand. Crawford's brand was a simple C with a star above it. Jacob's hands went still. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the star. Then he looked at the winding line he'd thought was a river. It wasn't a river. It was a snake uncoiling, swallowing the star. It was Crawford's brand, deliberately, mockingly altered. He looked up at Ayana, a dawning, terrifying understanding in his eyes. "The cattle," he said, his voice low. "They belonged to Crawford, didn't they?" Ayana didn't answer right away. She walked to the fire, staring into the flames. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was hard, the warrior peeking out from behind the gentle mask she wore. "Crawford has many enemies, Jacob," she said. "People he has cheated, families he has destroyed. My people are among them. We are not as helpless as he thinks we are." It all clicked into place. The silent nighttime delivery, the lack of tracks, the strange altered brand. This wasn't a gift from the spirits. This was a message, a declaration of war. Ayana's people, a hidden network of resistance he never knew existed, had struck at their enemy. They had taken his most valuable assets and delivered them to the man who was protecting one of their own. It was payment, it was a reward, and it was a trap. By accepting the cattle, by sheltering Ayana, he had chosen a side. He was no longer a neutral observer. He was an enemy of Thomas Crawford. "They know where you are," Jacob said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Your people. They've been watching you, watching us." "They have been protecting me," she corrected him gently. "And now, they are protecting you, too." But Jacob knew that the protection of a hidden tribe was nothing against the power of a man like Crawford. Crawford had money, guns, and the law in his pocket. It was only a matter of time before he came for what he believed was his. The next 3 weeks were lived on a knife's edge. Every snapped twig, every howl of a coyote sent Jacob reaching for his rifle. He and Ayana took turns standing watch through the night, their conversations growing shorter, their silences longer. The unspoken love between them was now a tangible thing, a source of both strength and profound pain. They had found each other, only to be torn apart by a world that would not let them be. The first heavy snow of the season fell, blanketing the land in a pristine, silent white. It was beautiful, and it was a death sentence. The mountain passes were now impassable. Ayana was trapped here until the spring thaw. They were trapped, together. They both knew that the snow that had imprisoned them had also set a deadline. Crawford's men couldn't move easily in this weather, but when the thaw came, they would come. They would come in force. The decision was made without words. They would enjoy this time, this stolen, borrowed time. They would pretend for a few short months that they were just a man and a woman, building a life in a small cabin, with a herd of cattle and a future that stretched beyond the spring. It was a beautiful lie, and like all beautiful lies, it was destined to be shattered. One morning just after sunrise, the sound came, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, muffled by the snow but getting closer. Too many horses for a lone traveler. Jacob grabbed his rifle. Ayanna moved to the window, the pistol that had been her constant companion now in her hand. They exchanged a look. No fear, just a grim, quiet acceptance. The lie was over. The real world had come knocking. "Stay back from the window," Jacob ordered. He peered through a crack in the logs. 3 riders, bundled against the cold, were making their way up the path to his cabin. They weren't the rough-looking drifters from the canyon. These men wore badges, Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies. Jacob's heart, which had been preparing for a gunfight, now seized with a different kind of fear. The law was here, and in this territory the law belonged to Crawford. "It's the sheriff," he told Ayanna. "Stay out of sight. Don't make a sound." He took a deep breath, opened the cabin door, and stepped out into the blinding white snow, his face a mask of neutrality. He squinted at the approaching lawman, his rifle held loosely, non-threateningly, at his side. "Morning, Sheriff," he called out, his voice steady. "Bit of a ride in this weather? Something I can help you with?" Morrison swung down from his horse, his face grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thornfield," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not here for a social call." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his eyes boring into Jacob. Then he delivered the news that changed everything. "Thomas Crawford is dead." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Crawford, dead. It was impossible. Men like Crawford didn't just die. They were forces of nature, permanent fixtures of the landscape. "What happened?" Jacob managed to ask, his mind reeling. "Shot," the sheriff said, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. 3 days ago, right on the porch of his own ranch house. Single bullet, clean through the heart. Fired from a long way off. Whoever did it was a hell of a shot." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. A hell of a shot. He thought of Ayanna, of the way she held a rifle, of the 3 dead men in Devil's Canyon. He kept his expression perfectly blank, a poker face learned in the bloody card games of the war. "That's a shame," Jacob said evenly. "Got any idea who did it?" "The list of people who wanted Crawford dead is longer than the Colorado River," Morrison grunted, "but that's not why I'm here." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "When we went through Crawford's papers, we found things. Ledgers. Records. Turns out our respectable cattle baron was in a much dirtier business, buying and selling native girls. The territorial government is displeased. They've sent in federal marshals to clean house." Jacob's mind was racing, putting the pieces together. Crawford's death had exposed his entire criminal enterprise. The power structure of the whole territory was collapsing. "What's this got to do with me?" Jacob asked, playing dumb. Morrison's gaze flicked toward the cabin, a knowing look in his eyes. "I've heard rumors, Thornfield. Rumors about a young native woman hiding out in these parts. Someone who might have escaped from Crawford. Someone who might be the star witness in a federal case that could put away every last one of Crawford's associates." It wasn't an accusation. It was an offer. "Hypothetically," Jacob said slowly, choosing his words with extreme care, "what would happen to a person like that?" "Hypothetically," the sheriff countered, "she'd be given full federal protection. Her testimony would be invaluable. And after it was all over, she'd be a free woman, free to go wherever she wanted. The government wants to make an example of Crawford's network. They want to show that this kind of thing won't be tolerated." Jacob looked at the sheriff, at this weary, compromised man. Morrison could have come here with a warrant and a posse. He could have dragged Ayanna out in chains, but he hadn't. He had come with a warning and a lifeline. "I'll have to think on that," Jacob said. "Don't think too long," Morrison said, turning to mount his horse. "Those federal marshals will be here in a week, and they won't be interested in hypothetical conversations." As the lawmen rode away, their dark shapes disappearing into the snow-covered trees, Jacob turned and walked back into the cabin. Ayana was standing by the table. Her small travel pack was at her feet. She had heard everything. "I should go," she said simply. "Disappear. It's what I'm good at." He looked at her, at this incredible, strong woman who had brought chaos and color and life back into his world. He thought of the lonely years before her and the certain lonely years that would follow if she left. "You could stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You could testify. You could be free. Not just running, but truly free." "And what then?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his. "What happens to me after the trials are over?" He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. They were small but strong, the hands of a survivor. "Then you stay here," he said, the words a quiet vow. "With me, we build a life, here, together." Her eyes filled with tears, the first he had ever seen her shed. The warrior's mask finally fell away, revealing the vulnerable young woman beneath. "Jacob." "I love you, Ayana," he said, the truth of it filling the small cabin, chasing away the last of the shadows. "I think I have from the very beginning." "I love you too," she whispered. And then she was in his arms, and he was holding her, holding on to this impossible, beautiful future that had appeared as mysteriously as a herd of cattle in a winter pasture. The mystery was finally over, or so he thought. They sat by the fire that night, making plans. Real plans. Not the desperate whispers of fugitives, but the hopeful dreams of two people starting a new life. Ayana would testify. The federal marshals would protect her. And when it was all done, this cabin would become their home. Jacob looked at her, a question that had been nagging at him finally bubbling to the surface. "Crawford," he said quietly. "The sheriff said it was a long-range shot, a difficult one." Ayana met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "My people have suffered under that man for a generation," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Justice comes in many forms, Jacob. Sometimes it comes from a courtroom, and sometimes," she paused, her eyes glinting in the firelight, "it comes from the end of a rifle, held by a steady hand." She never said another word about it. She didn't have to. Jacob finally understood the full truth. Her people hadn't just sent him a reward, they had eliminated the threat, permanently. The cattle, the warning, the final, deadly shot. It was all part of a plan, a precise, patient, and ruthless act of communal justice. A week later, the federal marshals arrived. Ayana, confident and poised, told them her story. Her testimony was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Over the next few months, Crawford's empire was dismantled, his associates arrested and brought to trial. The dark shadow that had hung over the territory for so long was finally lifted. And in the spring, when the snows melted and the world turned green again, Jacob Thornfield and Ayana were married. It was a simple ceremony on the porch of their cabin, with Sheriff Morrison serving as a witness. Their ranch prospered. The mysterious herd, the foundation of their new life, multiplied. They became one of the most successful ranching operations in the state. Years passed. The cabin grew, room by room, to hold their expanding family. Their first child was a daughter, a beautiful little girl with her mother's dark, intelligent eyes and her father's quiet strength. They named her Sarah. One evening, years later, Jacob stood on his porch, holding his daughter's hand, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Ayana came to stand beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. Their herd grazed peacefully in the distance, a living testament to the strange journey that had brought them together. He had never asked who pulled the trigger that ended Thomas Crawford's life. He didn't need to. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. He knew only this: a single act of kindness, a simple choice to help a stranger in a canyon, had brought him everything he had ever wanted. It had brought him a wife, a family, and a home. It had balanced the scales. The world had paid its debt. If you enjoyed this story of frontier justice, and you want to hear more tales where the lines between right and wrong get a little blurry, do me a favor. Take a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps more than you know. Thanks for listening.